Hello, this is Mary Alice Hudson. I'm a firm believer in the value of integrating social-emotional learning into classroom instruction. I've seen direct instruction in social-emotional skills change student behavior as students learn to recognize and self-regulate their emotions. It's my gut feeling that social-emotional learning should be integrated into remote learning situations as students lack direct contact with teachers and peers and may be experiencing isolation or fears related to personal safety and security. I used my literature review to explore my gut feeling and found literature to support it. I first explored characteristics of successful learners and high-quality instruction in traditional online learning environments. I found many of the identified characteristics of successful online learners overlap with skills taught through social-emotional learning instruction. Then I looked for ways to grow these characteristics in students remotely and build them into the remote learning environment. So based on my hunch, supported by my literature review, my initial thoughts about possible research questions would be: does incorporating social-emotional learning into remote learning promote student well-being? Does incorporating social-emotional learning into remote learning increase student engagement? Does incorporating social-emotional learning into remote learning improve student academic performance? And how can social-emotional learning be integrated into remote learning to help students grow social, emotional, and academic learning? I realize I might not want to try to explore all of these at once. I would consider narrowing my focus after I define well-being, engagement, and student performance and thought about ways to assess each. I'm also not sure I would use the final research question. I think it's interesting, but it would probably require a different study that compared a variety of approaches to integrating social-emotional learning into remote learning and their impact on one or all of the student outcomes listed. I believe these questions meet the criteria for SOTL because I have reviewed the relevant literature and transformed my hunches and ideas about my teaching and student learning into research questions that can be answered empirically. Results of this research would be used to improve my own instruction and shared to advance the teaching profession. I mentioned this in my last video, but when I thought about what I've learned so far from my exploration of SOTL literature, I'm again left with the question about who defines literature as SOTL. Is it the researcher or the reader? My guess is that it's the researcher. When I look at the journal titles I have used so far in my literature review, only one, Tech and Learning, feels like it's focused on student learning. But I wouldn't consider the article I used from this journal to be SOTL. It was more a theoretical exploration of whether or not technology helps or harms student social-emotional learning. Thinking about the articles from the other journals, I'd say none of them were SOTL, as none of the researchers were also teachers, and none of the research was identified as SOTL. So I'd say I've learned there's little, if any, SOTL research related to the topics I selected for this literature review. Is that surprising? No, I don't think so, as most of the literature I reviewed was set in K-12 education, where SOTL is less likely to be conducted. In my current role as a K-5 teacher, I believe I would utilize action research rather than SOTL in my classroom. I'm not sure there's a whole lot of difference between the two, but SOTL seems to have very little presence within K-12 education, and action research is within my comfort zone, so it's what I would use. If I were teaching in higher ed, I would definitely give SOTL a try. I like that it has a home within higher ed, and I can see this being a community of educators I would appreciate belonging to and working with. Thank you for listening, and here are my references.